Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Melissa Lamesch. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Melissa Lamesch was born on May 10, 1993, and lived in Mount Morris, Illinois. This is 106 miles west of Chicago. She lived with her parents, Gus and Deanna, and her 3 siblings. In 2011, Melissa graduated from high school. In 2013, she met a firefighter named Matthew Plody. He was about 6 years older than her, having been born on July 10, 1987. At first, they were friends, but later they became casual sexual partners. Sometimes this is referred to as friends with benefits. It appears as though Matthew had this arrangement with many different women. He was a very friendly guy, interested in a lot of benefits. Eventually, Melissa became an EMT for an ambulance service. In early 2020, she became pregnant with a son, who she named Barrett. Although she was excited about the pregnancy, Melissa did not tell people who the father was, only saying that he wanted nothing to do with Barrett. Melissa's plan was to raise her son alone. In October 2020, she moved back into her childhood home on South Hannah Avenue. By this time, her parents had divorced, and her father, Gus, owned the 1,100-square-foot house. Melissa made many preparations in the house, looking forward to her son. She ran into a few medical issues which complicated her situation. She fainted twice and was frequently tired. Due to her medical conditions, she was scheduled to be induced on Friday, November 27, 2020, the day after Thanksgiving. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Wednesday, November 25, 2020, the day before Thanksgiving, at 4:29 p.m., multiple 911 calls were placed reporting that smoke was coming from the house Melissa was living in. When firefighters arrived, they found Melissa dead. Her body was face down on the kitchen floor. Here is what the authorities discovered during the course of their investigation. There were no obvious significant injuries to Melissa's body. Investigators had to wait for autopsy results. The cause of the fire was also a mystery. No ignition sources were identified. Earlier that day, Melissa had been on the phone with her sister Cassie. After 2.5 hours of talking, Melissa told her sister that Matthew Plody was at the front door of the house. Melissa ended the call, telling her sister that she would call her back. It did not appear as though Melissa intended on having an extended interaction with Matthew. Rather, she was annoyed by his presence. Melissa never called her sister back. The police spoke to Matthew. He admitted to stopping by the house to visit Melissa. He indicated that, initially, he did not want to be involved in his son's life. However, he had a change of heart. He was once again talking to Melissa, and they were trying to work things out. When he visited that day, they had sex on the couch. He stayed in her house for no more than an hour before leaving. Melissa was alive when he departed. She had been talking about making lunch. So Matthew was trying to make it seem as though Melissa was going to the kitchen after he left. As I mentioned, this is where her body was found. The police suspected that Matthew was involved in Melissa's death, but they did not have enough evidence to make an arrest. Matthew was free to go. About 2 weeks after Melissa's death, the results of the autopsy came in. Her cause of death was strangulation. Melissa's body had also sustained blunt force injuries, like she had been involved in physical combat. The police had collected DNA from Melissa's body, including from under her fingernails. They sent it out to be tested, but the COVID-19 pandemic caused significant delays in getting results. While the investigators were waiting, they talked to the fire chief that Matthew worked for. They convinced the chief to secretly record a conversation with Matthew in the hope that Matthew would confess. The chief spoke to Matthew in September 2021, but Matthew denied any involvement in Melissa's death. When the DNA results finally came in, the police learned that the DNA under Melissa's fingernails was a match to Matthew. On March 9, 2022, Matthew Plody was arrested and charged with 10 offenses, including first-degree murder, the intentional homicide of an unborn child, residential arson, aggravated domestic battery, and concealment of a homicidal death. He was interviewed for 7 hours that day by the police, during which he never admitted or denied guilt. Matthew's trial started on March 18, 2024. On March 25, he was found guilty on all charges. At his sentencing on June 27, 2024, Matthew said, quote, "I share the pain and the sadness and the loss of Melissa and Barrett," unquote. The judge sentenced Matthew to a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also given concurrent terms of 60 years and 15 years. Now moving to my analysis. Matthew Plody maintains his innocence, and he has a few supporters. They argue that there is no evidence that he murdered Melissa. The state, of course, disagrees. Although there are some unanswered questions in this case, they maintain that Matthew must be guilty. This brings me to the question, was Matthew Plody guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Matthew admitted to visiting Melissa right before she died. The timing of this visit seems incredibly suspicious. If Matthew was planning on murdering Melissa, this would have been his last opportunity. The next day was Thanksgiving, so Melissa would not have been alone in the house, and the day after that, she was to be induced. During an interview with the police, Matthew specifically used the word deadline, so clearly he recognized that he was running out of time. It is difficult to believe that after having no interest in having a child, Matthew had a sudden and inexplicable change of heart. When Matthew came to the door, Melissa was on the phone with her sister. It seemed as though Melissa was surprised and annoyed by Matthew's visit. Not long after Matthew showed up, Melissa was strangled. In addition, she had been involved in a physical struggle. Matthew's DNA was found under her fingernails. This could have occurred during sex, but it is more consistent with a physical altercation, like Melissa was trying to defend herself from Matthew. After Melissa's murder, the house mysteriously caught fire. The cause of this fire was never determined, but an expert for the state thought it was arson. Matthew was a firefighter. He probably knew how to start a fire in a way which would be difficult to detect. During Matthew's 7-hour interview with the police, they accused him several times of killing Melissa. He was emotionless the entire time and never denied he was the killer. At one point, Matthew said, "I had no intention of hurting Melissa." This is not an admission, but it is a strange thing for an innocent person to say. Matthew was not happy about Melissa getting pregnant. He wanted her to get an abortion, but she refused. There was a particularly high level of concern from Matthew about having to financially support Melissa and their son. Matthew never mentioned to his coworkers that he was going to be a father. He was living with a woman at the time of the murder and was having sex with many other women. Maybe Matthew was concerned that having a child would interfere with his fast-paced and exciting lifestyle. Moving to the exculpatory factors, an expert for the defense indicated the cause of the fire could not be determined. It may or may not have been arson. There was no way to know. Matthew's DNA was found under Melissa's fingernails, but this could have happened during sex, as I mentioned. Technically, it is possible that someone else murdered Melissa and set the fire. Maybe they were stalking Melissa. When they saw Matthew leave the house, they decided to frame him for the murder. That's pretty much it for the exculpatory factors. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Matthew Plody was guilty? Yes, in my opinion, he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Matthew Plody was self-centered, cold, callous, excitement-seeking, fearless, hedonistic, impulsive, irresponsible, dominant, deceptive, violent, obsessed with sex, had a sense of entitlement, and was exceedingly creepy. He maintained multiple casual sexual relationships and was not interested in being a father. When Melissa told him that she was pregnant, Matthew did not react very well. He attempted to manipulate Melissa into terminating the pregnancy, but he was not successful. On the day Melissa died, Matthew stopped by her house with the intent of working out some type of deal with her. In a manner of speaking, he wanted to put out a fire. He told the police he had no intention of hurting Melissa. This may have been true when he first arrived to the house. Maybe Matthew offered Melissa some money in exchange for a promise not to pursue more money later. Perhaps he was still hoping she would terminate the pregnancy. Whatever his suggestion, Melissa rejected it. After the couple had sex, Matthew strangled Melissa out of anger. Knowing he was in trouble, Matthew somehow set a fire in the kitchen, hoping it would destroy all the evidence. The fire did some damage, but did not really affect Melissa's body. Investigators figured out Her cause of death was strangulation, which led to Matthew being prosecuted. Matthew's behavior during his second interview with the police was unusual. He ultimately asked for an attorney, which ended the interview, but that was after 7 hours. It's not unusual that a jury would see the entire interview that a suspect had with the police, but in this case, the state only played 4 of the 7 hours. That's how slow-paced and non-productive the interview was. Matthew did not express any emotions, including anger, and he never denied being the killer. There is the sense that Matthew was keeping his options open during that interview. He knew that talking to the police was a bad idea, but he was tempted to admit to murder because he wanted to play the victim. Matthew probably believed that what Melissa did to him was wrong, and he was eager to share his hardship. He wanted to tell his story. He struggled with this for a while before realizing that he was playing with fire. This is when he requested an attorney. In the end, Matthew was convicted because he placed himself at the scene of the murder and was the last known person to see Melissa alive. The fact that he was a firefighter and someone set a fire in the house did not help his case either. Now moving to my final thoughts. Studies have shown that subclinical psychopathy is overrepresented in certain careers. For example, surgeons, pilots, skydivers, soldiers, police officers, paramedics, and firefighters are more likely to have subclinical psychopathy than the general population. This means they have traits of psychopathy, but not to such an extent as to disrupt functioning or cause impairment. It is a useful level of psychopathy as opposed to a destructive level. A person who has subclinical psychopathy may be a little cold, callous, dominant, and fearless, but not to such a degree that they would qualify as having something like antisocial personality disorder. The traits of subclinical psychopathy are actually necessary for society to function. Without them, there would not be enough people to fill many of the high-stress jobs. Every now and then, a person with regular psychopathy manages to get past gatekeepers and find employment in an action-packed career. The psychopathic traits may even make them stand out in their job in a good way. For example, many people respect those who are fearless. If they are able to conceal the manifestation of the destructive traits, they may never be detected. They are psychopathic, but able to pass as someone with subclinical psychopathy. The darker elements remain active, but just out of sight. There is no way to know if that's what happened in the case of Matthew Plody, but it's a possibility. It's also possible that Matthew only had subclinical psychopathic traits, as one would expect with most people in his field. These traits are positively correlated with 2 facets of extroversion, sensation-seeking and assertiveness. These 2 facets may have been enough to put Matthew in a difficult position. His sensation-seeking behavior led to Melissa's pregnancy, and his assertiveness facilitated a confrontation with her. During that confrontation, Matthew impulsively killed her. Afterward, his low neuroticism allowed him to remain calm as he attempted to destroy evidence. Fortunately, Matthew was better at extinguishing fires than extinguishing suspicion. Those are my thoughts in the case of Melissa Lamesch. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.